Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the early access build of Squad that was on a free weekend recently. So this is basically as of November 11th of this year. And this is a tactical shooter developed by Off-World Industries, and it's basically a spiritual successor to the Project Reality mod for Battlefield 2. Now it's worth noting that they do plan on this being in early access until 2017, so it's entirely possible that everything I talk about here could be changed by the time the full version of the game comes out. But I can definitely see where the potential is, and unfortunately that's mostly where I have to talk about the game because there's really not all that much in the game right now. As far as I know, there are about 2 or 3 maps, and there's only a couple of game modes. At least that was all I was able to play while I was able to mess around with this during the free weekend. And while that was enough to give me a general idea of how the game plays and what its strengths and weaknesses are, it wasn't really enough to say, hey, this is something I could very easily recommend to everyone in its current state. I definitely cannot recommend this game in its current state just because it is so unfinished. This means that the people who are going to be really interested in this game are the people who already bought it, the die-hard Project Reality fans who want to support the development anyway. If it does look like something that's interesting to you, I would recommend waiting until it's in a more finished state, or if you really want to support the development, then you can get the early access version, but for a general audience I can't recommend that. Now then, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and finding out exactly what it is. As I said before, it is a tactical first-person shooter, and it basically just has 2 teams of 50 going up against each other in some fairly basic game modes. Now, the number of players does have an effect on the map size as well as the visuals, because they have to compensate to some degree for the fact that there's so many players on there at once, and this is an Unreal Engine 4 game. This means that while the presentation is generally fairly decent, it's nothing particularly impressive other than the environmental lighting effects, which can be rather impressive. Everything just has some pretty decent texture work, the modeling is generally very well done, and the animations are reasonably smooth and fluid, but there's nothing in here that is just going to make your jaw drop or anything like that. Similarly, on the sound design, you have music that is completely forgettable. In fact, I completely forgot there was even music in the game at all until I remembered that, oh wait, they actually sell the soundtrack for this thing. And there's also sound effects which are decent, but they could use a bit of work. I get the feeling this isn't really much of a priority for them, but if they could get some more beefy cracks on the rifle fire as well as some more significant bass to that, then that would be definitely well appreciated, because what we have right now is fairly wimpy. In fact, it's right on that cusp between just good enough and wimpy, so if they could push it over into the just good enough at the very least, then that would be great. Now, I don't remember any voice acting in this thing at all, and a big reason for that is because of the VoIP system they have. They actually have several different VoIPs in place to where you can chat with your squad as well as your local area, so just a few people around you, and then there's also the ability to chat with your entire team. So if anything, you hear your teammates all the time, and there's really no reason to worry too much about the voice acting for various characters in the game. Now, of course, presentation is very much subject to change because they'll probably start working on that a bit more when they get most of the gameplay mechanics and everything like that finished up. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. But as far as the actual game itself goes, that's where things get a bit more interesting. There's no single-player campaign or anything like that, so it all falls to the multiplayer to bring things up. And I would describe the multiplayer as somewhere between Battlefield and Arma. It's not quite as much of a simulator as Arma is, which means that it's a lot more fun than Arma is, and it's not quite as arcadey as Battlefield is, which means that if you're more tactically minded and more realistically minded, then this might be the game for you. You really can't take much damage before going down, and you do actually have the possibility of bleeding out, so you need to bandage yourself up and get a medic to come over and heal you up as soon as possible. And a medic can, of course, revive you to some degree anyway. You get shot in the head, well, there's just nothing they can do for you. And the idea is to work with your team and to go into this combined arms gameplay in order to complete your various objectives, which can be things like capture these points in order, and eventually you get to the enemy's base, and if you capture that point, then you win. Or you can do things like destroy various caches that are scattered around the map, or of course prevent the enemy from destroying them if you're on the defending team. But either way, you start off by spawning into a squad, and you select your role within that squad, which can be things like rifleman or medic or a squad support character, which can be either a machine gunner or a sniper or something along those lines. And there are only limited amounts of the various positions in the squad support roles available, so you can only have, I believe, 3 of them in total, and that's something you need to keep in mind when you're building up your squad. If you would be better served in a different role, or somebody else would be a lot better in a certain role, then you may want to give it to them instead of just taking up that role and being dead weight for your team. And your squad leader actually has a very important role. They can either place rally points, which is where you can spawn in the field, or they can give you permission to get into various vehicles that spawn at your base. And having a good squad leader actually can make or break the experience for you, because if you have someone who knows what they're doing in that position, then you're coordinating with your squad in order to actually go around and flank the enemy, to set up rally points, to basically lay down cover fire for other squads, any number of things that are actually very important for the outcome of a match. This is a game that emphasizes teamwork to an absolutely massive degree, and it really does excel when you get a really good team together and everybody knows what they're doing and you're all working together really well. That is an absolute joy. And if you were ever wondering why I always say Battlefield 2 is the best game in the Battlefield series, this is why. When you had teams like this working together in Battlefield, it was phenomenal. And the sad reality is that since basically 2142, they haven't really emphasized teamwork in quite the same degree, and as a result, all of the Call of Duty players have started migrating over to Battlefield, and everyone runs around like headless chickens. There is barely any teamwork involved in that series anymore, and the people who were really into that sort of thing ended up going over to the Project Reality mod, which made things more realistic and emphasized teamwork even more than base Battlefield 2 did. And then when the Project Reality developers started making this, then a lot of the players from that moved on to this and started to help them build up this very tactical first-person shooter. And that's where the game really does shine. It has a lot of people playing it who are very much teamwork oriented, and they both know what they're doing and are willing to work with you to help you understand how to play the game. Now, where the problems start to come in are in obviously technical problems because the game is just unfinished, as well as the map designs, which are gigantic. In fact, they're a bit too gigantic. It takes absolutely forever to get from point A to point B in this thing, and thus it can get really boring in that interim period where you're going between points and you're not running into any resistance along the way. A big reason for that is that the movement speed is rather slow, which is fine for a tactical shooter. It's just that when you're trying to get across an absolutely gigantic map, it means that it's going to take a long time to get anywhere unless you have a vehicle. Which of course means that that's something of a double-edged sword here. And then of course there's the fact that there's just not really all that much content in the game right now. There's only a few weapons available, and it's all stuff that you've seen in just about every other modern military shooter out there, so it's nothing particularly interesting, but definitely effective. And the vehicle selection is rather small right now, which means that basically you're able to use technicals or Humvees and really not much else than that. Which means that they're very useful for getting around the map in a much quicker fashion, but they're not quite as useful for actually supporting your squad's offensive efforts. You can, of course, get on the machine guns on them and use those to suppress an enemy squad or to outright annihilate them if they're all running out in the open. But generally speaking, the players are not going to be that stupid, and they're going to definitely take cover and not stick their heads out to be shot to bits by a machine gun. I have the feeling that things will get a lot more interesting when they get the rest of the vehicles put into the game, and then we get some true combined arms warfare instead of just a bunch of dudes running around in Humvees and technicals and occasionally getting some kills with them. But by far the biggest thing they need to sort out are the technical problems that the game has. It is rather buggy, to say the least. A lot of people experience very frequent crashes, and while I personally didn't experience any crashes, I did experience a fair bit of performance problems that can probably be sorted out by the time the game finally launches. But I think that all speaks volumes, because those are really the only major downsides I can think of in this thing, other than, hey, your team might not be that good, and thus you just get curb stomped. But then again, most of the people playing this kind of thing are the people who would be pretty decent at playing it anyway, so you don't really have too much to worry about there. Because once you get past that and the technical problems, you got a rather solid base for things to come. Yes, they need to put in more content, yes, they need to put in more modes and things like that, but all that really means is that they just need to finish the game. Once they finish the game, I imagine it'll be something I can very easily recommend, at least I hope so. But until then, we just have to wait and see. I wouldn't recommend it in its current state just because it is so bare bones and because it is so plagued with technical problems. But once they get that sorted out, and once they get more content in there, I could very easily recommend it. At least if a sort of light milsim is your kind of thing. It's not quite as simmy as Arma, because Arma is just mind-numbingly boring, but it's not quite as arcadey as Battlefield, which means that it's just kind of that happy medium ground. It's just realistic enough that it's very compelling, but it's not so realistic that it becomes boring. And that really does work wonders for the game in the long run. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how this turns out, and I will take a look at it once its full release comes out. But until then, I will have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this up if you are interested in supporting it in its such an early stage of development, even though I can really only recommend that to the people who really, really want to support the game in its current state of development. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch everybody in later videos.